At any given time, there are 50 serial killers active in the United States. In all, there may be more than 4,000 unidentified serial killers roaming the country. Among the most famous of those is Ted Bundy. A dread to most and an icon to few, Bundy seized the world's attention through his many murders, rapes, and dismemberments. In all, he ended his spree with dozens of victims and possibly over 100. Even today, it's not rare to find murderers and would-bes trying to emulate him. But who exactly was he and what all did he do? As a disclaimer, this video is about a horrible criminal, so if you don't feel comfortable watching it, I understand. Please watch my other videos, which are much tamer than this one but just as interesting. I'm sure you'll like them. Bundy's childhood was almost as strange as his adult life and full of contradictions. His mother, 22-year-old Eleanor Cowell, gave birth to him at an unwed mother's home in Burlington, Vermont in 1946. Burlington being the largest port and city in Vermont, it's fitting that Bundy's father was a sailor. Beyond this, it's impossible to say who his father was as different sources give different names. Regardless, Eleanor left Bundy in Vermont and went home to Philadelphia, only going back for Bundy because her father told her to. When she brought him back to Philadelphia, her parents, ashamed of her for having a child out of wedlock, made the family agree to tell Bundy that his mother Eleanor was his sister, and that his grandparents Samuel and Eleanor Sr. were his parents. He spent the first few years of his life in Philadelphia, showing dark signs early on. For instance, some sources say he would leave butcher knives under the cover while his young aunt, who he thought was his sister, was sleeping, and beat and kill animals, though these claims may be false or overstated. It's also been suggested that his grandfather abused him in fits of rage, though Bundy himself denied such claims. When he was 4 years old, Eleanor took Bundy and moved to Tacoma, Washington, still claiming that she was his sister. There she met Bundy's stepfather, Johnny Bundy, and the two raised him together. It's not clear whether Eleanor ever admitted to being Bundy's mother, but he said he could tell anyways, as the 20-year age gap between siblings didn't make sense to him. When Bundy saw his birth certificate, which either read illegitimate or father unknown, it confirmed his suspicions. He took it in stride, telling interviewers that finding out you're illegitimate or adopted is normal. He denied having an abusive childhood, saying in a 1989 interview that he grew up in a wonderful home with two dedicated and loving parents, a quote-unquote Christian household with no drinking, smoking, gambling, or physical abuse. In the same interview, he suggested his early exposure to might have stirred up a compulsion in him that he unleashed when he began drinking as an adult. Ted's high school years are also a wonder. Ted described himself as a loner, being unable to socialize properly, but other students describe him as semi-popular, and he apparently at least went on one date. Around that time, he also got in trouble with the law, being picked up a few times for theft, and he was caught spying on women in their homes more than once. His arrest disappeared from his record when he turned 18, and as delinquent as he was, he didn't even seem close to the man he'd become. By the time he was in college, Bundy must have become more social because he started going out with Stephanie Brooks, his first girlfriend. She was from California but attended the University of Washington like Ted. When she graduated in 1968, she moved to San Francisco and Ted was determined to follow her there, even getting a scholarship to study at Stanford. It wouldn't work, however, and she broke up with him, a devastating blow. It's commonly believed that Bundy's future victims were modeled after her, with traits mimicking hers such as brown hair parted down the middle. After the breakup, Ted would do more school hopping and eventually graduate from the University of Washington in 1972 when he was just 25 years old. His talent in psychology was undeniable as he graduated with distinction, and one professor even lamented the fact that he'd rather study law than continue studying psychology, writing in a letter of recommendation to a law school that our loss is your gain. He became more active in the social sphere and was getting popular among local politicians because of work he did for them, such as the then current governor of Washington, Daniel Evans, whose campaign Ted worked for. Ted was handsome, well-educated, and charismatic, so it seemed like he had quite the life ahead of him. That all changed in 1974. Most people agree that Bundy's time in the sun started in January 1974 in the Seattle area, his home. His first victim, Karen Sparks, also known as Joni Lenz, was a young college student, just 18 years old. She was attending the University of Washington, the same school Bundy had graduated from 2 years earlier. One night while she was sleeping, Bundy snuck into her room and beat her in the head with a metal rod until she was unconscious, then sexually assaulted her with it. Horrific as it was, Sparks survived, and after coming out of a 10-day coma, she had no memory of the attack, but the brain damage Bundy left her with is a permanent reminder of his immense evil. His second victim wasn't so lucky. Just a month later, another student at the same school and living in the same basement housing named Linda Ann Healy would become the first woman Bundy was confirmed to have killed. Just like before, Bundy snuck in her room, this time using a spare key that she and her roommates kept in the mailbox. He bludgeoned her, changed her out of her then bloody nightgown into fresh clothes, and hung the nightgown up in the closet. He left, taking Healy with him, along with some of her clothes, her backpack, and her pillowcase. Her Her skull would later be found on Taylor Mountain, just an hour's drive from her home. This was only the beginning of Bundy's rampage. Over the next 4 years, Bundy would embark on a cross-country killing spree so vicious, so prolific that few have ever matched it. Over 36 deaths are confirmed to be his handiwork, and some estimates put his total murder count at over 100. And as Miss Sparks' encounter shows, death wasn't the only thing women had to fear about Bundy. To better frame his death count, think of it this way. 36 women in 4 years is 1 every 40 days or so. 100 women in 4 years is 1 every 2 weeks, or as often as some people get paid. But how'd he do it, and how'd he get away with it for so long? Armed with his understanding of the human mind, Ted developed a method that allowed him to do his dirt and evade notice considerably well. To start, he'd act vulnerable, inviting young women, usually in their teens or early 20s, to help him load things into his car. To help with the act, he originally wore an arm brace and pretended to be handicapped, but this wasn't his only trick. Sometimes, he'd pretend to be a firefighter or a police officer in order to lure in unsuspecting young women. Once he got them to the car, he'd hit them over the head with a metal bar and then handcuff them and put him in his vehicle, a tan 68 Volkswagen Beetle. At the time, it was one of the most popular cars in the world, so it didn't really stand out. In addition, he removed the passenger seat and would lay the unconscious women on the floor so they wouldn't be seen while he was driving in traffic. Once he got them to his destination, he'd often rape the women, kill them, and hide their bodies. Sometimes he'd even rape their corpses. At other times, he'd dispose of their bodies more completely, such as when he burned 19-year-old Donna Manson's skull in his then-girlfriend's fireplace. His girlfriend was apparently unaware, as Bundy would later say, "Of all the things I did to Liz, this is probably the one she's least likely to forgive me for." All that said, Ted's run could have been much shorter. Like many serial killers, Ted became more brazen over the course of his campaign. After having kidnapped 6 women in the spring and summer of 1974 without arousing any suspicion, he made one of his most daring attempts yet. He kidnapped 2 women, 23-year-old Janice Ann Ott and 19-year-old Denise Marie Naslin, from a beach near Seattle in Washington's Lake Sammamish State Park. Years later, Bundy would tell investigators in Florida that he made one of them watch as he killed the other, although he took the statement back the day before he was executed. Regardless of whether they were alive at the same time, their remains were found together 2 months later, just 2 miles east of the lake. Several female witnesses mentioned that a man in an arm cast named Ted had asked them to help him unhook his boat from his Beetle that day. This is exactly how he trapped Janice, although Naslin's kidnapping is less clear. What is known is that after an argument with her boyfriend, Naslin went to use a park restroom while her friends and boyfriend waited for her. She never came back. After the park closed and she still hadn't returned, her friends reported her missing. Her parents said she wasn't the type to go off on her own, which given Bundy's history of violence makes it possible he took her by force. After taking witness statements, police released a suspect description to the public, and shortly afterwards 4 people called in identifying the suspect as Ted Bundy, including his professor and even his girlfriend Elizabeth, who called multiple times to report him. Initially, nothing came of it as police simply didn't believe a clean-cut law student like Ted would do such things. Had they done their due diligence, Bundy's spree may have ended then and there, something he has in common with fellow killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Like with Dahmer, these police are partially responsible for Bundy's crimes after this point. Bundy soon left Washington for Utah, where he attended the University of Utah Law School. This worked out well for him as investigations were starting to get underway back home. However, rather than give up his life of crime, he continued, leading to a string of murders in Utah and Colorado. He even attempted to kidnap 2 girls in one day again, 18-year-old Carol Duranch and 17-year-old Deborah Kent on November 8, 1974. Thankfully, Duranch was able to escape her encounter, and she'd later tell interviewers the details of what happened that day. While she was shopping at the mall, her car was broken into, and Bundy, pretending to be a police officer, asked her to come back to the station with him to file a police report. Complete with a badge and cuffs, his costume convinced the young girl, and soon she was in his car and on her way to a horrible end. As Bundy went down a side street and parked on a curb, however, Duranch realized the situation wasn't right. He managed to handcuff one of her hands, but Duranch fought him off and got away. In doing so, she became one of the few Bundy survivors, a fact which would come back to haunt him shortly. Deborah Kent disappeared after she left her parents watching a play at Viewmont High School so she could pick her brother up from an ice skating rink. After her parents left the play and saw their car still in the parking lot, they knew something was wrong. After kidnapping Kent from the school parking lot, Bundy took her to his apartment and kept her alive for, in his own words, half a day. Then he kept her body for another half day before disposing of it. Police searched and searched for her remains, but it wasn't until Bundy admitted to killing her and told police where to find them that they were able to. Police initially only found a single kneecap, but in 2015 they found more remains in Fruit Heights, a city just 20 minutes north of Salt Lake City. As young as she was, she wouldn't be Bundy's youngest victim. In fact, she was one of 3 17-year-olds who disappeared from the Salt Lake City area, and Bundy's victims in Utah were as young as 12 years old. Even after all this, Bundy managed to escape justice for quite some time. He was first arrested in August 1975 when he was pulled over after casing a home where two young girls were home alone. He was found to have burglary tools, including a ski mask, some rope, and a crowbar, and was arrested for evading an officer. Almost 3 weeks later, he was pointed out in a lineup by Carol Durant and two other young women. He was charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault and found guilty of the former, being sentenced in 1976 to a 1 to 15-year prison sentence. The same crime today carries a 15-year minimum sentence in Utah. Still in 1976, he was charged with the murder of another woman, Karen Campbell. He had killed the 23-year-old nurse in January 1975 after abducting her from the Wildwood Inn in Estes Park, Colorado. In typical Bundy fashion, he lured her in by using crutches and asking for help carrying his ski boots. Her body hadn't been found until weeks later when Louise Oliver was driving down Owl Creek Road just 3 miles from the resort. When Louise noticed a bunch of birds gathered around one spot off the road, she went to investigate, and there she found Campbell's body frozen in snow. It took 24 hours for her body to thaw, after which it showed obvious signs of a brutal assault, and her lack of clothes made rape a possibility. The string of disappearances in close by Utah and Washington didn't escape investigators' minds, and when Bundy was arrested for kidnapping, he hit their radar. Crucial evidence in his arrest included her hairs being found in his car, credit card receipts of him gassing up just 40 minutes away from the inn, and eyewitness testimony that he was indeed at the hotel the night she disappeared. He was extradited to Aspen, Colorado in 1977 to await trial for these charges and ended up escaping twice. Being a law student, he was allowed to assist his defense. This meant that he was allowed access to the law library on the second floor of the Pitkin County Courthouse, and for whatever reason, the judge deemed it unnecessary to put him in shackles or cuffs, meaning he could walk around the library freely. In his own words, he saw a number of opportunities to escape, and escape he did. On June 7, 1977, after one officer went outside for a smoke break and left him unattended, Bundy jumped out of a window the officer had left open and ran to the mountains. He stayed in a cabin for a few days before heading back into town and stealing a car whose keys were in the ignition. 6 days after his escape, he was caught again and rearrested, this time being sent to a jail in Glenwood Springs. With help from Carol Boone, a woman he had met in Washington in 1974, he escaped there too. After losing weight to fit through a vent which he had carved to be wide enough, he crawled through the vents and into a jailer's apartment where he'd change clothes and make his second escape. This time, he was gone for good. Bundy then embarked on a cross-country trip through Chicago, Illinois, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Atlanta, Georgia, before ultimately arriving in Tallahassee, Florida in January 1978. Once there, he rented an apartment and soon began his final saga. At 3 a.m. on January 15th, he broke into the Omega Chi sorority house at Florida State University and killed two students, Margaret Bowman, age 21, and Lisa Levy, age 20, strangling them to death before beating two other girls in the same building. Overhearing the commotion, two girls next door called the police, but Bundy left before they got there. He fled, breaking into a house nearby and attacking the young girl that lived there, herself an FSU student. Thankfully, the 5 of them survived, but none of them could describe their attacker. His rampage ended with the kidnapping and murder of a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach, who disappeared from school on February 9th. This would be his last murder, as just 6 days later he was arrested after driving wildly in a stolen car. Leach's body was found under a shed at Sewanee State Park just 2 months later. When he arrived at the police station, Bundy initially gave the police a fake ID, saying he was an FSU student named Kenneth. 2 days later, he revealed his true identity. Though he knew his game was over, Bundy was far from remorseful. He was charged with 2 murders and 3 attempted murders initially and was given a plea deal that would allow him to avoid the death penalty, but only if he admitted to 3 specific murders and attempts. He refused, however, and pressed his trial on, telling prosecutors that an indictment was all they were going to get. In 1979, Bundy's trial would become the first trial ever televised, bringing in massive attention from across the nation. It was a strange trial to say the least. For instance, it was the first time that bite marks had ever been considered as evidence, with Bundy's teeth being compared to the marks on Levy's body. Other evidence, such as hairs matching his being found at crime scenes and eyewitness testimony, was used alongside this to convict Bundy of all 5 charges. The evidence might seem strange, but it's important to remember that DNA testing didn't even exist until the 80s, and even then it was rare and expensive, so they had to use what they could. All in all, Bundy received 2 death sentences for the crimes. It wasn't over though. Bundy had another trial in January 1980, this time for the death of Kimberly Leach. In both trials, Bundy had a legion of fangirls who would send him mail and wanted to go out with him. Some even showed up to court dressed like his victims with hairstyle to match, even dyed brown. It no doubt hurt many of them when he called Carol Boone to the stand to question her, asking her to marry him. After she said yes, he responded, "I do hereby marry you," marrying her while she was still on the stand. This took advantage of an old Florida law saying that any declaration of marriage in court with a judge present was valid. She'd go on to have a daughter with Ted while he was still in prison and smuggle in drugs for him. All strangeness aside, Bundy was found guilty again and received a third death sentence. During his trials and afterwards, Bundy admitted to several dark, gruesome details, including that he'd decapitate women and have sex with their dead bodies, often until they were too decomposed to continue, that he'd photographed these dead bodies, that he kept at least a dozen heads as trophies, and that he'd even eat some of his victims to possess them, making them part of him. He even said that he felt like God as he watched a person's life leave their body. In 1986, just hours before he was supposed to die, Bundy was granted a stay of execution by a federal court of appeals so they could review his case. Ironically, in an attempt to overturn the trial, Bundy's attorney argued that Bundy, who had been part of his own defense, was not competent enough to have done so, a stark difference from the well-educated defense they ran with before. He would ultimately lose his appeal and confess to over 30 murders just days before he died. After this, he was executed on January 24, 1989. He was given a standard last meal of steak, eggs, hash browns, and toast, but he didn't even touch it once. With his last words, he gave his well wishes to his loved ones, after which some 42 people watched in person as he was electrocuted. Outside, cheers rang out knowing the monster was finally getting what he deserved. Tailgates and barbecues were held in celebration, and back at FSU, the students of Omega Chi couldn't be happier. So died the most hated man in America at 7:16 a.m. that day. Although most people cheered, some lamented Bundy's death. Carol zealously defended him through everything, and his mom, perhaps in denial, did too, saying that he doesn't go around killing women and little children. If Bundy had never escaped from prison in Colorado, the murders in Florida might never have taken place. Even more, if the cops in Washington had done their jobs properly when Bundy's own girlfriend called in to report him, scores of women might not have died. Instead, biases in law enforcement allowed the killer to continue his sick game. Though Bundy is most at fault, those officers also have his victims' blood on their hands. Ted Bundy was and is a horrifying case. Even among serial killers, his death toll is prolific and his torturous methods sickening. Though his life was far from normal, he seemed like a normal man. He was in the prime of his youth with a budding career and the world ahead of him. But he wasn't normal. He was a perverted, cruel killer who left a legacy of violence that's almost unmatched in the annals of history. Today, he's the subject of countless documentaries on TV and the internet, as his deeds continue to intrigue and shock generations. For some, he's even an inspiration. Ted Bundy was a serial killer's serial killer, one who will always be remembered. Did you know the movie Silence of the Lambs was inspired by Bundy? While Bundy was in prison awaiting his death sentence, a new killer popped up in the Seattle-Tacoma region. His name was Gary Ridgway, but he's more well known as the Green River Killer since that's where he dumped most of his victims. While the FBI were working on the case, Bundy reached out to see if he could help them. He gave the police insight into a serial killer's mind and helped them form a profile. He even suggested that the police stake out a fresh grave left by the killer as he'd likely return to have sex with the body, which turned out to be true, although the police didn't take much of his advice. In Silence of the Lambs, serial killer and psychiatrist Hannibal Lecter's help is sought to catch the murderous Buffalo Bill. Although Bundy's role in catching the Green River Killer may not have been very big, it's certainly interesting. Bundy was the first person to ever be called a serial killer. Before him, others were often known as multiple murderers or mass murderers. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and comment, and don't forget to subscribe, as all of those will help the channel to grow. If you'd like to submit a story or contact me for any other reason, I'm available at any of the contacts and socials below. I'm also open to collaborations. Be sure to follow me and check back for more. Until next time, thank you. This is Mr. Mysteries.